Greetings. My sister likes to say to me, people are evil. When I told that to a conservative friend, he replied, oh, people are terrible. Now, I don't share that view. I think people are self-interested, and that being self-interested can mimic being evil or terrible because it makes people willing, sometimes, to cut corners, to lie, to cheat, if they think they can get away with it, even to do harm to other people if they can justify it to themselves in some way, and especially if the harm to other people is at a psychological remove from them. This is, of course, setting aside psychopaths, whose self-interestedness is of a purer kind than most. It seems to me, though, that if you think people are evil or terrible, then you should be for regulation, not against it. Even self-interestedness is enough to make regulation desirable, it seems to me. However, the more terrible or evil people are, the greater the need for individuals living in society to be protected from the actions of their fellows. That means OSHA regulations protecting workers' health and safety against employers who might be able to make more money by placing those workers' health and safety in danger. Surely, no one needs to be reminded that historically, employers often have, in fact, placed the pursuit of profit ahead of their employees' health and safety. It means EPA regulations protecting the rest of society from businessmen who could make the most money by indiscriminately pouring pollutants into the air we all breathe and into the water we all drink. Again, surely no one needs to be reminded that historically businessmen often have maximized profit by minimizing care for the air we breathe or the water we drink. It means SEC regulations protecting people from being cheated by their fellows in the financial industry. And again, surely no one needs to be reminded that historically those in the financial industry have sometimes chosen to make money by unethical, even outright fraudulent means. If you think everyone is good and decent and fair-minded, oh, then you might think that we should let the people govern themselves instead of imposing burdensome regulations on them. Precisely because if you think everyone is good and decent and fair-minded, well, then you won't think that the sort of problems that require regulation will arise or are ones anybody will need to be protected from. But if you think people are terrible or evil, then it baffles me how you could not think of regulation as at least a necessary evil. And even if all you think is that people are self-interested, I would still be baffled were you not to think of regulation as at least a necessary evil. I do completely understand if someone objects that regulation can be overdone and that there are some regulations that should be repealed. A few points should be made in connection with this. First, we should remember that there are reasons for regulations. You and I might not always be aware of the reasons for a particular regulation, and you and I are certainly not aware of all of the reasons for every regulation. So, of course, some regulations are going to appear to be pointless or unnecessary to us, even if they're not. But we should remember that there are, in fact, reasons for regulations, no matter how visible or invisible those reasons might be to us. We don't have OSHA issuing health and safety regulations because some liberal somewhere wanted to impose needless burdens on hard-working, job-creating businessmen, or even because some liberal somewhere imagined that someday, just possibly, hypothetically, they might be needed. We have OSHA issuing health and safety regulations because historically workplaces often have been unsafe or unhealthful because that was how employers could maximize their profit. We don't have the FDA checking meat to make sure it isn't putrid because some liberal somewhere decided to make government bigger and more intrusive. Or even because some liberal somewhere imagined that someday, just possibly, hypothetically, such checking might be needed. We have the FDA checking meat to make sure it isn't putrid because meat that has gone bad has historically been sold to consumers. You don't have the EPA issuing pollution standards because some liberal somewhere wanted to place undue burdens on wealth creation, interfering with the freedom of businessmen to run their businesses as they see fit. Or even because some liberal somewhere imagined that someday, hypothetically, Some businessmen might possibly put too much of some pollutant into the air or water. We have the EPA issuing pollution standards because historically, pouring unlimited pollutants into the air and water has maximized some businessmen's profit. We don't have SEC regulations because some liberal somewhere decided that bigger government was better government, or even because some liberal somewhere imagined that possibly, just hypothetically, someone in the financial industry might behave unethically. We have SEC regulations because historically, some people working in the financial industry have acted unethically in order to make money. We have regulations and regulatory agencies because people have historically cheated and engaged in fraud and put employees in harm's way and sold unsafe food and done harm to the environment. There are reasons, good ones, why we have regulations and regulatory agencies. You and I might not always know what the reason is for a particular regulation, but there almost surely is one. Second, it's always going to be easy to get enthusiastic agreement with an anti-regulation position, because there are always going to be regulations that I think are overly burdensome or excessive in their requirements or seemingly unnecessary, at least once they're pointed out to me. And there will be regulations with which you are dissatisfied, and there will be regulations with which the next guy is dissatisfied, and so on. You and I and the next guy might not always be unhappy about the same regulations, but hardly anybody is going to be happy about each and every regulation that any regulatory agency has ever promulgated. And if everybody's dissatisfied with some regulation, it's going to be easy to get some people to translate that particular dissatisfaction into a generalized dissatisfaction with the very idea of regulation, and to get people to be dissatisfied with what they think of as big government. We have to be wary of such a tendency. It's rather like thinking of a treaty as a bad treaty because you don't like something in it. Maybe if you were in on the negotiations, you'd see that the negotiators gave something to get something and that what they got in exchange was really good. And maybe the treaty as a whole is really good. It's easy to miss the forest for the trees. Third, part of deciding which regulations to impose is the making of judgment calls. And where judgment calls are required, you'll always get disagreement. Should thus and such toxin be limited to 20 parts per billion? 15? 10? The approximate level deemed impermissible might be fairly clear from the available data, but the exact level might be a matter of line drawing that has a certain arbitrariness to it. If 15 parts per billion is chosen, why not 16? There might not be any reason one could give to justify the exact choice, even though there might be plenty of good reason justifying the approximate choice. It will be easy for there to be disagreement, especially when there are financial interests at stake. We have to accept the making of judgment calls in the formulation of regulations, just as we have to accept them from referees in sporting events, without pointing to the making of judgment calls as reason to abolish all regulation. It seems to me that anyone who accepts that human beings do indeed lie, cheat, cut corners, and engage in fraud to make money, whether he thinks that those human beings are self-interested or instead thinks that those human beings are evil or terrible, whether he thinks that their misdeeds are perfectly understandable as efforts to make sure that they can support themselves and their families in both the short term and the long term, or instead thinks that their misdeeds should be roundly condemned as evil and terrible, should be able to see that doing away with regulation and regulatory agencies in general is a bad idea. We need to be protected against those practices of our fellows that would cause the rest of us harm, including putting workers in needlessly unsafe or unhealthful working conditions, selling meat that is unsafe to eat, pouring needlessly high levels of toxins into the air we breathe and the water we drink, and engaging in financial fraud. It's perfectly understandable that people want to make money to support themselves and their families, and that they want to make more money in order to prosper. But if people are evil or terrible, or just self-interested, we need to protect ourselves against their tendencies to cheat. I'll finish by pointing out that there are sometimes benefits to regulation that go unseen, and that it's easy for those benefits to lead, paradoxically, to opposition to what is seen as burdensome regulation. Consider the case of a businessman who wants to be an environmental good guy, paying the cost for whatever apparatus is needed to minimize his factory's pollution of the air and water. Suppose he has a competitor who doesn't care about the environment and who makes a similar product using a similar factory. Then the environmental good guy puts himself at a competitive disadvantage by incurring the extra expense of the anti-pollution apparatus. Also, his own shareholders, and possibly his board of directors, might object that he is needlessly leaving profit on the table. He might end up losing his position because he isn't maximizing corporate profits. But if the EPA promulgates a regulation requiring both companies to pay for the anti-pollution apparatus, then the environmental good guy will no longer place his company at a competitive disadvantage. Instead, he'll be playing on a level playing field when he makes the expenditure for that apparatus. Also, if his shareholders cry that he is leaving profit on the table, he can point to the EPA regulation and say that he is simply complying with the law. No longer need the environmental good guy decide between doing nothing and needlessly polluting the air and water, on one hand, and putting his company at a competitive disadvantage, on the other. And no longer need the environmental good guy decide between maximizing profits, on one hand, and being environmentally responsible but risking his own job via the wrath of his company's shareholders and board of directors, on the other. He can now be environmentally responsible while playing on a level playing field. And he can now justify leaving profits on the table in so doing by pointing to his compliance with an EPA regulation. I think that constitutes a social good, both because the amount of pollution is lessened and because environmental responsibility is not punished. The only problem I see with this is that those very shareholders who cry that profit is being left on the table will proceed to blame the EPA and what they might derisively call big government for their failure to make as much as they could have had environmental responsibility not been required of their company. And they might then vote for a political party that runs on opposing all governmental regulation, which is the very position that would allow those evil, terrible human beings' worst impulses to go unchecked, so that they could lie, cheat, put workers in unsafe or unhealthful circumstances, sell spoiled meat, unrestrictedly pour toxins into the air and water, commit financial fraud, and so on, with impunity. It's important, therefore, that those who bear the costs of regulations understand that there are good reasons for them and not try to do away with them. But those who think of human nature as evil or terrible should have no trouble supporting the continued existence of regulatory agencies like OSHA, the FDA, the EPA, and the SEC as a protection for all of us against humanity's worst impulses. And I would expect them to vigorously oppose efforts to undercut those regulatory agencies. As always, may reason and compassion be your guides.